Now, what does he mean when he says in verse 2, we have died to sin? Well, sometimes the easiest way to find out what Paul means is to first say what he doesn't mean. And we know what he doesn't mean. He doesn't mean that we're no longer tempted to sin. Christians are still tempted to sin. We know that he doesn't mean that Christians no longer commit sin. Christians commit sin. We sin daily, actually, in word, thoughts, and actions. Anytime we don't love God completely and love our neighbor as ourselves, we're sinning, because that's the summary of God's law. So what does Paul mean when he says we're dead to sin? Well, he goes on to explain it. Look what he says in verse 5. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. And verse 6 is the key verse. We know that our old self was crucified with Christ in order that the body of sin, that probably means that our bodies in the service of sin, might be brought to nothing so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. So what is Paul saying when he says we've died to sin? He's saying this: your old life, the person you were before Christ, BC, the person you would be without Christ, your sinful person, the person you were in Adam, unrighteous, condemned under the law of God, headed for hell, that person was in union with Christ, and that person died with Christ on the cross. Our old self, our old unregenerate self, our former self, was crucified as a fact of history when Jesus died. It was personally appropriated when we were converted, and it's sacramentally sealed in our baptism. Our old self was crucified with Him. Sinful, old man Logan Almy died on the cross with Christ. And so He's gone, is what he's saying here, as an indicative of the gospel. And what that means is that there has been a decisive breach with sin in our Christian life. When we are in union with Christ, something decisive and radical has happened. Sin has been decisively defeated through our union with Christ. Because look what he says in verse 6 and 7. We are no longer enslaved to sin, the end of verse 6. Then verse 7, for the one who has died has been set free from sin. Literally, has been justified from sin. So a decisive break has happened through our union with Christ, so that the life of sin's dominion has been broken. If you are a Christian, sin no longer has dominion over you. You still may commit sin. You still are tempted with sin. But the tyranny of sin has been overthrown. In fact, he later says this in verse 14. He says, sin will have no dominion over you. Not might have no dominion over you. Sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. When we were living under the law, when we were in Adam, sin had dominion. Sin was our master. We were under the reign of sin and death. But through our union with Christ, we've been brought out of the reign of sin and death. Through our union with Christ, we have been brought into the reign of righteousness and life. Sin has been decisively defeated. Sin has been decisively dethroned. So the faith that unites us to Jesus Christ as justifier also unites us to Jesus Christ as sanctifier. It is absolutely impossible, biblically, to have Christ as Savior and not also have Him as Lord. He is one Christ. It is one salvation. It is justification and sanctification. Though they are distinct, they are inseparable. All whom God justifies, He will, in this life, sanctify, because all who are justified through faith in Jesus are united to Jesus in His death, burial, and resurrection.